All right, well, welcome everyone to Shivali's Books Online. We're so happy to have you with us tonight. This evening, we have two fabulous writers in conversation, and at the end of the hour, we're going to open the floor for an audience Q&A. And at that point, you can raise your hand or put a question in the chat, which we highly encourage you to do. But first, I would love you to join me in welcoming our guest for this evening. We have Tom Lutz, who is the founding editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books. He's the author of And the Monkey Learned Nothing, Drinking Mare's Milk on the Roof of the World, and Crying and More. And his latest work, Born Slippy, was his first novel. He is joining us tonight to discuss Seth Greenland's A Kingdom of Tender Colors. Seth is an award-winning playwright, screenwriter, and novelist. His play Jungle Rot won the Kennedy Center for New American Plays Award and the American Theater Critics Association Award. His work has appeared in the LA Times, the LA Review of Books, Le Figaro, Le Monde, among many more. And Seth and Tom, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks for having us.
It's our pleasure. This is a great book, Kingdom of Tender Colors, and it is a departure for Seth. It's a nonfiction book. He's written a lot of novels. He's written a lot of screenplays. He's written a lot of plays. But this is something new and different. And I think that the best thing we can do for people, Seth, is have you read a little bit of it to get us started.
Sure, let me set the table. This section I'm going to read is, it takes place right after I find out that I'm in a particularly dire health situation. I've been given a diagnosis that is quite frightening, and this is where we pick up this part of the story. That night we are in our bedroom. I am seated on the bed and Susan stands looking out the window. She is weeping because, unwilling to articulate it for obvious reasons, she knows there is a distinct chance that relatively soon I am going to not be here. Sympathy would be the right move for me, the smart and sensitive gesture, to hold and comfort her in this time of distress. But since I am the one who was ill, that is difficult. Can I put her needs before mine at this moment? Be the rock that she requires? I would like to be that rock, but right now my heart is not in it. I am reeling, my conception of life shattered, and I am too busy feeling sorry for myself. I am relatively young and vigorous. Then what has caused my cells to behave like British soccer hooligans on a beach weekend in Spain? What has caused my cancer? The toxic environment that swirls around us, chemicals in water, additives in food. I went to summer camp in the mountains, and every few weeks trucks would ride through spraying DDT, enveloping all of Camp Mackinac in a toxic fog. The gestation period of certain cancers can last decades. Had mine originated in the innocence of a long ago summer, a time of baseball, fireflies, and incipiently mutating cells? Or perhaps it's just incredibly rotten luck. As Susan tries to drift off, I think about the music I want played at my funeral. Who Knows Where the Time Goes by the English folk singer Sandy Denny is one of my favorite songs. An achingly beautiful meditation on loss and the passage of time, and as much as I love it, a little on the head. A friend of ours had attended a funeral where they played Sing, Sing, Sing by Benny Goodman, a raucous swing tune. A bold choice, but it wouldn't work for me. If Who Knows Where the Time Goes is too elegiac, Sing, Sing, Sing was too comical. It's fine to tell funny stories, but a comedy soundtrack seems tone deaf. How to strike a balance between sobriety and mischief, the twin poles by which I've been navigating my entire life. Charles Mingus's powerful tribute to Lester Young, Goodbye Pork Pie Hat, could work, but while its smoky, cool menthol tones would create a nightclub feeling that certain mourners might appreciate, Charles Mingus wrote it for someone else, and it strikes me as presumptuous, not to say unoriginal, for it to be played at my funeral. Put a pin in the music and try to think about readings. An Elegy by Shelley? Too pretentious. Funeral Blues by Auden? An astonishingly good poem, but where is the intersection of Auden and me, other than we both write in the same language? Something American by Whitman, perhaps Oh Captain, My Captain. While the merit of the poem is unchallenged, a mourner declaiming it at my funeral would feel like an overdramatic moment from a high school play. And I imagine the friend I asked to read it reporting, Seth wanted me to read Oh Captain, My Captain, and rolling his eyes. Susan's eyes are closed. She is oblivious to my ruminations. Is she asleep? Quietly, I say, I want a bagpipe player. Where? At my funeral. Bagpipes are a bold stroke. No one is singing, so there will be an absence of lyrics to parse. The sound is sorrowful, and a lone piper strikes an indelible image. There's no Scottish in me, but Susan's family name is MacLeod, and it is our daughter's middle name. I am Scots adjacent. Good enough. Pleased with myself, I say, should he be in a kilt, or would the kilt be too much? You're not being funny. I want a guy from one of those British Army outfits, the Royal Scots Fusiliers. Shut up, please. What's with you? Stop joking around. I don't like it. How do you think my way would sound on the bagpipes? I continue, unable to stop beating this baleful fancy to an unsightly pulp. He could do a whole Sinatra medley. Then I want the pallbearers in sharkskin suits and pork pie hats. I was just now thinking about Lester Young, who not only pretty much invented the jazz saxophone, but was also famous for wearing a pork pie hat, I nonsensically tell my wife, who has other things to worry about, like being married to a lunatic. Unable to stop, I tell her, I want 6 guys who look like Lester Young to empty a pint of Hennessy on my grave. Susan props herself on her elbow and looks at me. She is not pleased. The gallows humor is a good coping tool for some, less so for others. It's hard to stop the logorrheic shtick, but I get the message. Kissing her goodnight, I try to think simple thoughts, easy thoughts, springtimes and flowers. Should I be involved in choosing the ones for my funeral? A kingdom of tender colors.
And I suggested that you might want to read that section. I'm glad you did. In part because I think that the combination of this this self-lacerating humor,
Mm-hmm.
right, and the kind of mundane thoughts that one has even in times of crisis, and the kind of the rumination, as you say, rumination is it kind of rolls through in a tone that is comic but not sticky, funny but not jokey, and in which Susan, your wife, provides a really interesting foil, of a number of different kinds through the course of the book, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things, of course, I know Susan, and so one of the things that was really interesting to me was to watch you kind of construct her as a literary character as well as a real person. And I assume that you were conscious of doing that as you went through.
Yeah, very conscious. Rendering someone you know so intimately as a literary character is a very high bar to set for yourself, because not only do you have to make somebody three-dimensional and believable and compelling and the kind of character that somebody wants to follow through a book, but unlike fictional characters, that person is going to read what you write, presumably, and have their own critique. And so you're writing from your authorial perspective and the perspective of with the perspective of the audience in mind, the readership in mind, but also with that third perspective in mind, this Pirandellian perspective of a character who's very much their own individual and who can talk back to you in a literal way. And the literary character, of course, stands apart from the real person, but they're always in relationship. And both of those things, both the literary character and the real person, are in relationship to you as the author. So it gets very, very complicated. And I will say right now, I will never do it again.
Is that right?
It's well, for lots of reasons, but I'm very happy to have done it. I think it was a terrific literary exercise for me to do. As a writer, I'm very happy I wrote the book, and that's one of the reasons, because I was able to write about people who I know and who I love, and put them in a narrative context. But boy, writing about real people who are in your life is an incredibly delicate act, and very complicated, and very, very rewarding when it comes off correctly, but very risky, really, and great to do once, but I don't know that I would ever do it again.
And in fact, your fiction is not autofiction. The Bones has some real people in it,
Sure.
I think, but the other novels are not. They're not very traceable to anybody that might be a model for the characters. They don't seem to be part of your life.
That's accurate. I mean, there are people in the novels that are composites of people that I know, and even in the Bones, everybody is pretty much a composite.
Mhm.
But no, I've not written autofiction, and this is a real departure, really,
Yeah.
because to write about the lives of actual people is it's an entirely different exercise, and that's one of the reasons I wanted to do it, because I had written all these novels and I wanted a challenge, and I'm fascinated by the form of memoir. I think it's very difficult to write a good one, and that was what I set out to do.
You know, I made an enemy for life with a man I interviewed when I was writing doing my book about slackers, and I described him as having reddish hair, wearing a heavy metal T-shirt, and having not much of a chin, and it literally made him an enemy for life. And I thought I didn't think it would be news to him, but it apparently was, and he didn't like it. And John Recchi said once in an interview that you can say anything you want about a person, a real live person, as long as you say they're pretty, they'll forgive you.
Yeah, I think that's obviously he was sort of joking, I think, because obviously you can't say that about everybody. But I think there's certain details that when you're writing about real people, you generally leave out, unless you want to do score settling. And I was very, very conscious in this book not to do anything that could be remotely construed as score settling. And that became clear to me as I went through. I wrote a lot of drafts, as I always do, and I took people who were referenced, no major characters, but people who were referenced in earlier drafts didn't make it into the final draft, for exactly that reason, because I thought, well, they might read it, and I didn't want to get angry emails. And if they were not entirely germane to the narrative, well, there was no point putting that kind of material in there. And I hewed to that really closely. And I think it's a wise decision, because the kind of memoir where you're settling scores was something that that was not what this was going to be about.
Yeah, and we're too old to do that.
Yeah.
We don't want to do that anymore.
Right.
But that said, your father and your mother are characters.
Yes.
Could you have published this while they were alive?
That's a great question. There was nothing that I wrote about my mother that I wouldn't have published while she was alive. And my father read a draft of this that I wrote a dozen years ago. I've been working, we might want to say at this point, I wrote a version of this book 12 years ago and put it in a drawer. And my father read that draft and liked it very much. And I don't know that he would have liked this version as much, because this was more honest. And he's, I think, very vividly drawn in the book. And there are things in it that he might not have found entirely flattering, but everything is true. And I talked about the book with my brother, who only read this version a couple of weeks ago, actually. And he and I had a conversation about it the other day. And I said, you know, do you think I was fair to Dad? And he said, you were totally fair. You were completely honest. And that's how he was. And he thought it was a really good portrait. And I really took that to heart. So I think my dad, who was a very sensitive guy, might have had certain problems with some of the things that I wrote about, but it's all true. And it was all there because it was very much part of what I was going through. While I was dealing with this life crisis in my mid-30s, he had become a widower 18 months earlier and had embarked on a course of behavior and a series of unfortunate events, to borrow from Lemony Snicket, that was running parallel to my own catastrophe. And it became inevitably a part of my own story. And I chose to write about that. And I think it made it certainly for a better book, actually, and a more entertaining one. And as to whether he would have liked it, probably not. I think I could say that with some confidence.
I think that is correct.
Yeah.
There are some parts of it he would have loved, and some parts of it not.
And I'll say this also. My dad is such a great character. I'm not sure that I'm done writing about him, actually, because I only wrote about the parts of his life that were germane to the story I was telling here. And he had an epic 20th century life and is a great subject, Leo Greenland. And I do think that might be something that I may return to, because I think there are larger subjects that one can be got at by writing about that particular man. And he happens to be my father. And you and I can spend the rest of the hour talking about fathers and sons, but we don't want to get lost in that cul-de-sac.
No, that's not.
No.
That's what. Now there are lots of ways to write a memoir, right? There are lots of ways to structure a memoir, and you made a particular decision in this one to kind of focus the book on really on a big question. How does one confront one's own mortality? How does one think about mortality when the question of one's own mortality gets thrust upon one unexpectedly in the prime of life, and what kind of impact does that have going forward? Right. That's the philosophical question, the epistemological question that the book kind of is. It's on that ground. Mm-hmm. Right, it's set on that ground, and it's structured around that question, and that was obviously the decision that you made going forward. You decided not to tell. I was born in the suburbs of New York, and moving forward.
Well, to your point, the book is very much about finding a way of being in the world when you think you already have one, because I was, by and large, the events that I was writing about took place in 1993 when I was 37 years old, and had been an adult for a while, and I don't know that I had a philosophy that I could have necessarily articulated at that time, but I think I had a philosophy that I was living by. And, I got so rocked when I got this diagnosis that I really re-evaluated everything. And so the book is, it's epistemological, certainly, about my knowledge and expanding that knowledge, and also ontological, to really, as long as we're slinging philosophy around, about the nature of being and what the nature of my being was going to be going forward, and how that would be reinvented to be somehow more congruent with what I had gone through. And because I was a comedy writer, the book has lots of jokes and is very funny as I explore these epistemological and ontological questions. But yeah, that's what it is. And it becomes, through using all these stories, through the device of narrative and all the stories that I tell, basically it becomes about how to rejigger the way you move through the world after you get hit by a meteor, basically.
Yeah, and in part that requires, or the way you go about it is to talk through some of the great traditions of thinking about these issues. That is Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Zen, Hinduism, right? You end up kind of going through all the major world religions, or most of the major world religions, thinking through, thinking with them about the issues you're facing and the kind of emotions you're feeling.
No, that's right, because it was all about, what I was interested in those traditions was the view that each had in terms of how the end of life went, and not so much the dying, but what came after, and the ideas of the afterlife. Because, I was looking pretty hard at dying. I had stage 4 cancer and wasn't given a great prognosis, and the survival rate for what I had was not that high. And so yeah, I gave a lot of thought to that, and that becomes a section of the book. And I didn't reach any conclusions other than the here and now is what's important, because I don't buy into anybody's idea of the afterlife. I don't really think there is one. I think this is the lesson of the book, insofar as there's a lesson in the book. There might be a few, actually, but a big one is everything is the here and now. Get done what you need to do now. Love who you can love now. Accept the love that you can accept now, and get as much out of being alive in this moment that you possibly can. Because whatever comes next, and who knows if there's an afterlife. I certainly don't, after thinking about it for for a long time now. I'm not willing to put my flag on any of those beaches. And that's one of the things that I explored both at the time and in the writing of the book, because a big part of the writing of the book was because, again, the events of the book largely took place 27 years ago. So a lot of the book also is reflecting on, well, what have I learned in the 27 years since? So the book takes place in several time frames, and much of it is, what happened at that time, but also how does it resonate 27 years later, really? I worked on a television show for a couple of years, a drama, and one of the problems for me was we would make all these plot points happen, and then we'd go on to the next plot point, and they wouldn't resonate. And that was kind of a bête noire for me. And I always wanted to go back and kind of explore how each plot point would affect all the characters in a much more granular way. And in this book, I do that. And through these things that occur, they're still resonating. These things that happened in 1993, they're resonating Monday morning, today. And the book is very much about that, how one experiences things and how these things become a part of us, and how by being open to them being there and being present and not suppressing them, they become a very living part of who we are, and hopefully can make dealing with life and whatever hardships subsequently occur in our lives easier to address.
Yeah, and of course, I mean, one of the interesting things about the way you bring these various kind of traditions of thinking about the afterlife into the discussion is that it brings up the bigger question of the kind of the culture of illness and death, and how we in American culture in these decades have approached the question of death, how we approach the question of illness, and there's an American historian who said that in the 19th century, people were very comfortable talking about death. You think of Emmeline Grangerford in Huckleberry Finn, who writes death poetry, obituary poetry for people that she's never met, but nobody could talk about sex. You weren't allowed to talk about sex.
Right.
And then the 20th century was all about everybody talking about sex all of the time, and you weren't allowed to talk about death.
Right.
So you're kind of coming up against in your life, I mean, this period of life that you're discussing, you're coming up against the ways we talk about death, and the way and there's, well, let me start there, and I'll add a second follow-up to it. What you conclude about that is that we're not very good at it. Right.
We're terrible at it because, well, for all kinds of reasons. But one of the things that I write about and this comes out of illness at a young age, and this also ties into the idea of death, is fear and shame. And these things are, first of all, let me just say, I think they guide most of human behavior, fear and shame, actually. And when it comes to death, particularly if you're not an old person, those are something that everyone is navigating, really. We have this tremendous fear of it because, as you said, no one is allowed to talk about it. And it's shameful because it's this unspoken thing. And one of the reasons that the earlier version of the book didn't really work was because I wasn't willing to face that. And what that version of the book was a series of events. And then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, without really tearing off the skin and getting to what was below, getting to the fear and the shame and all of that goes with what a full picture of life is, which of course includes death.
Which is why the humor works so well. I mean, the humor is what is the tool to do
Yeah,
it.
of course.
The humor is the thing that rips the curtain back and shows you your shame and fear, right?
No, exactly. Yeah. It's also, and it's the gateway drug for the book because the book is, as funny as it is, it allows me to talk about those things in a way that I think people are very receptive to, actually. And it's you laugh, you cry.
Yeah. And I recently was in Nepal and went to a temple that was on a sacred river. That where people did cremation ceremonies, and I watched my first cremations, and it's a very, it's one of those moments where you can see a very different relation to death
Sure.
taking place in front of your eyes. And I'll let you use that as a prompt any way you want.
Yeah, no, thank you for that prompt. It's great. Susan and I were in Varanasi a few years ago in India, a river on the Ganges, where Hindus, very, very religious Hindus, will go to cremate their relatives. And up and down the riverbank are all the, as you know, because you've been there, are all these flaming pyres. And for the entire time we were in Varanasi, I found myself drawn to these burning corpses for just that reason that you were talking about. I had this experience of the nearness of death years earlier, and I welcomed being exposed to it to that degree, where it was not only in the open, but celebration isn't the wrong word, but where it was a very obvious and apparent and public attending to the idea of death. And I just was completely fascinated with it, taken with it, couldn't get enough of it, to a degree that I think Susan found. She was with me for most of it, but she found my fascination a bit unsettling, I think, to a certain degree, because I was hypnotized. And because I was like a 12-year-old boy who was allowed to go into a peep show, if I could say something so horribly sexist in 2020. That's how fascinated I was. And again, to your point, it was because we are not allowed to have that fascination with it. We're not allowed to talk about it, really. And if we think about it, we need to keep it to ourselves. And I really chose in this book to do the opposite. And this book, and that's why it has so many jokes in it, because the book is essentially a meditation on my own mortality, but it's funny. And I keep saying that because I don't think anyone's ever written a book quite like that. And that was the exercise. It's how can I write about thinking I was going to die and not dying and make it really funny? I can use my comedy writer muscle to do that. And I think that's why the book is original.
And that comedy writing muscle is very well honed. It's a timing.
Yeah, exactly.
Timing is important, and part of the construction of Susan as a character has to do with the timing of the way she pulls the rug out from under whatever whenever you're getting maudlin, whenever you're getting self-involved.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Susan's gift as a character is, well, first, she's a great person, obviously, but she's very funny, but in a different way than I am. She's very droll, and she comes under the joke a lot. And so being able to, and I think the version of her on the page is pretty close to what she is, actually. And I think that I captured her drollness to a degree. And of course, I'm flying all over the room in the book, and I'm always freaking out and going nuts. And she is the ballast, but in a way that is kind of this kind of offbeat comedic way that I think works really well for the book.
You kind of promised in a note you sent to friends that there would be coffee enemas tonight.
Yes.
So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then there are a lot of people in the room, so maybe we could have some questions.
All right, thank you for the coffee enema prompt, by the way. I'm always excited to talk about coffee enemas. So very briefly, for the people who haven't read the book, I went through a very rigorous course of chemotherapy. I nearly died from it. I wound up in the hospital with no white blood cells and an infection and 105 fever. Somehow I survived. The oncologist said, "You're done." Am I cured? No, I'm not cured. Good luck, he said. I said, good luck, that's not good enough. Susan found a doctor for me, a guy called Nicholas Gonzalez, who was one of the people to whom the book is dedicated. I'm speaking quickly now because I want to get through this so we can get to the Q&A. And Dr. Gonzalez had a protocol which involved many, many things, one of which was organic beef every day, 100 different pills every day, and 4 coffee enemas every day, 2 in the morning, 2 in the evening. I did the Gonzalez regimen for 5 years. Don't take out your calculators, I'll do it for you. That's more than 5,000 coffee enemas over the course of 5 years. I may not be the world champ now, but I will tell you, I was then. So I'm here to answer all your coffee enema questions. It was a remarkable experience. I haven't done one in a very long time. I don't regret a single one. Thank you for asking.
And, we have our first question.
All right.
It's from Terry.
Okay.
And the question is about the cover
Okay.
of the book. It's gorgeous. Terry says, could you tell us a little about the photograph itself and the circumstances in which it was
Cover.
taken?
My lovely wife, that's me. This was taken in a town on the Amalfi coast of Italy called Ravello, about a mile from Gore Vidal's house. We didn't know Gore Vidal, although we climbed over his wall to take a peek at where he lived. We were on our honeymoon that week. So this is in 1990. The photograph is 30 years old. And I believe it was probably taken by the waiter. I have no idea who took the picture. And my editor said, do you have some pictures? We want to use pictures of you for the cover. And I thought he was going to do a collage. And I just thought, oh, that sounds fantastic, a collage of the cover. And when he sent me this, I only prayed that Susan would sign off on letting this be the cover. And she very graciously did. And because I think beautiful women can help sell books, and it keeps people from looking at me, which I'm very grateful for. And Susan was incredibly gracious and signed off on this being the cover. It's our honeymoon picture.
And do we have other questions? I think that there's a hand raising function.
Yes, indeed. You can raise your hand or submit a question to the chat or the Q&A. So we've got a couple raised hands now. We do have a question from Andrew in the chat who's asking regular or decaf, which you can choose.
I never understood the point of decaf.
It looks like we've got 3 with their hand raised. I know Erica had her hand up first, so I am going to allow you to speak. If you can unmute yourself, you can pose your question.
Hi, Erica.
Hi, Seth. It's actually Albert.
Hold on.
Hi, Albert.
I unmuted it. I unmuted it. Seth, first of all, I feel it's a wonderful book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for writing it. So I have a couple questions. One is Susan now planning to write a book about the same period? I'd like to see the other point of view.
I would love to read that book. You'll have to ask her, although I suspect not.
And the other thing is, and partly you answered this to Tom's questions, but in a broad sense, what did you learn in the process of writing the book? Was there something or a few things, in the big picture that you learned either about yourself or about that period, or about anything else,
Well, that's a great question. Thank you for asking that. The big thing I learned is what a chicken I was as a writer, and I learned how not to be a chicken. And as I alluded earlier, the reason the first version of that book ultimately didn't work was I was not willing to be as honest as I think one needs to be to write a memoir that really is going to hit people in the solar plexus. Paul Bowles is a writer I really like. The Sheltering Sky is one of my favorite books. He wrote a memoir called Without Stopping. And it's an okay memoir, but a friend of his read the book and the friend said to Paul about Paul Bowles, you should have called the memoir Without Telling. and that really resonated with me. And I thought, why write this book if I'm not going to be brutally honest with myself? Not just about myself, but with myself. And that was the big thing that I learned. And on a craft level, I learned how to write a memoir, which I had no clue how to do when I started.
Right. And when you, last part, Seth, and thank you for the answer, when you took it out of the drawer after being in the drawer for a period of years, what was the motivation then? Why then did you take it out of the drawer?
I had written, at that point, I had just published my 5th novel. And I wanted to try doing nonfiction. I'd done a bunch of journalism. I really enjoyed doing that. I had all these what I thought were terrific stories, not just from that period, but from other periods of my life that I thought I could braid into the larger story of that very bad year. And I thought the idea of having a hell year and telling that story and using that hell year as a clothesline to tell these other stories about my life that had no real other place to live that I could see would be a really worthwhile exercise as a writer. And I think I turned out to be right.
Yeah, well, you did a wonderful job, and thank you very much for bringing all of us this book.
Thank you for the kind words. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. I think some hands went down, but we do have a question now from Steve in the chat asking, has COVID triggered feelings from the period covered in the memoir?
Has COVID triggered feelings from the period covered?
Mm-hmm.
Only, yes, in a way, because in a sense, I think having been as ill as I was prepared me to deal with death in a way during COVID that a lot of people who had not had that experience were not quite as prepared. It was kind of I feel like having lived through that year was in a way kind of a user's manual for living through COVID. When death not just was, death is still so present. I mean, I think the other day we hit a new record for infections. And for example, being a New Yorker, when I saw those, the Army field hospitals go up in Central Park, that really shook me. That was an incredibly vivid image, like seeing Civil War hospitals in Central Park. But I was inured to the idea of death to a degree, because I went to Death University in 1993 and I got a degree. So I learned how to navigate it psychologically. So during the COVID period that we're still living through, unfortunately, as the months went by, it struck me, it felt like, well, now everybody has cancer, because not literally, obviously, but everybody has cancer because everybody's thinking about death. Everybody's thinking about dying. Everybody's thinking they might get COVID and die. I mean, certainly people who are, in my age cohort, and I think, I can't speak for younger people, obviously, but the ubiquity of death, certainly, and the ubiquity of thinking about it, certainly in most of the blue states, is a very real thing. And so, yeah, the parallels, I think, are quite profound. For me, at least.
It's quite an answer. We've got a couple more questions. Wow, we've got quite a few questions coming in. We've really opened the faucet now.
Yeah, let's talk about death. I'm here to answer your questions about death. And
in that vein, we've got a question from Art, who remembers your father. And he said he's one of the most unforgettable people I've ever met. Can you please share a few anecdotes about him?
About my dad? Geez, yeah, sure. The story I told, there was a story I told when I delivered a eulogy for my dad. It'll be 10 years ago in this coming June. And he and I was a young man at the time. I was probably in my early 20s. And we were having lunch at a restaurant in New York City. And two women lit up cigarettes at a nearby table. And this is when you could still smoke in restaurants, but it was not a crowded restaurant, and we were enjoying our meal. And my dad very politely said, we're still eating. It would be very nice if you could please not smoke cigarettes while we ate. And they continued smoking. Well, my dad, not one to suffer that kind of disrespect, took out a Winston Churchill sized cigar, and he lit his cigar, and he sent zeppelins of smoke over their table. And I just remember, I'm not even sure why I'm telling that story. It's just, it so captures him. He was a lovely man, cultivated and successful, but do not cross him. And he was a font of narrative. And as I said, I suspect I may return to him as a subject. And if we had more time, I'd tell more stories about my dad, but that's the first one that comes to mind because it captures, he was enjoying his meal. We were having a lovely conversation and someone treated him badly. And that was how he responded.
Mm. That kind of carries in nicely to the next question we've got about, I mean, you mentioned not wanting to settle a score with writing a memoir. So George is wondering if you could share with us a section about your mother's funeral director.
Yeah. So my mom sadly died of cancer, as it happened, 18 months before I was diagnosed. And we were all very upset. She was very young. She was younger than I am now. And went to her funeral and they buried her. And as happens at a funeral, you'll find. And about a week goes by and my dad said to me, we're out at lunch again in another restaurant. No one was smoking near us this time. And my dad said to me, you know, Seth, I think they buried mom facing the wrong direction. And I said, what do you mean in the wrong direction? And he said, yeah, I think her feet are up by the headstone. And I said, no, you're just upset. That's, you know, you've gone through a terrible trauma. You're upset. They buried her facing the right direction, I'm pretty sure. And a week goes by and he calls me. He says, no, Seth, I'm pretty sure what happened is they buried her in the wrong direction. And I said, okay, you know, if you think so, then I'm there to support you and we'll go see what happens. And my father called up the funeral home, who contacted the cemetery, and the funeral director met us at the cemetery. And my brother and my father and the rabbi, because of course the Jews have a prayer for this when you have to exhume a casket for whatever reason. The rabbi said a barucha, and they dug up the casket, and the casket was buried facing the wrong direction. And they lifted it up and they turned it around and they reburied it. And I think what George, who asked the question, is wondering is, why did my father not murder the funeral director, who should have known that the casket was facing the wrong direction, because he had one job at that moment and he did not discharge his duties in to the best of his capacity. But that time my father held his temper and did not enshroud the funeral director in a zeppelin of cigar smoke. That story's in the book, by the way.
And you were, in a sense, settling a score with the funeral director.
I was settling a score with a funeral director, a minor character. Exactly right. And we should say he looked like a funeral director from Spoon River Anthology, the Edgar Lee Masters cycle of poems. And had I written him more specifically, I think perhaps an editor would have said, isn't he a cliche? But in fact, that's what he looked like. And I guess I did settle a bit of a score, although I didn't say what his name was.
All right, it looks like we've got time for about one or two more questions. So one is coming in from Maureen, who's already read the book, absolutely loved it, and would love to hear you read it. So would you consider doing an Audible version?
If the publisher asked me to do an Audible version, I would be happy to do that. Put a pin in that idea. Or Maureen, you could write to the publisher and say, where's the Audible version? They would take it more seriously coming from you than coming from me, I suspect.
Maybe we should all write in. I think that would be a wonderful experience.
I would love to read this book. I think that would be fantastic.
Wonderful. And so our next question is from someone who's curious about what is in the so-called user manual of dealing with death and dying. And are these actual things or is it all mental?
Oh, well, read the book. It all can be had for the experience of reading the book. That's I think the best and most concise answer I should say about that. Be open, always consider, and recognize the inevitability. Beyond that, you know, I expand on that idea in the book, though. You'll find at some length.
I think you could actually, if you wanted to, you could say a little bit more about that. That is, I think that there are times when you actually come to conclusions about these things, not just at the end, but along the way and at the end. And maybe give a sample of a user manual like portable conclusion that you came
Well,
to about some aspect of this.
Well, here's the thing. The book for me really turned out not to be about dying, but about living and how to live and how best to live. And that's the lesson of the book insofar as it has any lessons. I didn't write it to be didactic, but it turned out, I guess, to have some lessons attached. But it was more in that vein, because in terms of death, and death in a nutshell, it sounds ridiculous to even talk about it, but I don't believe in an afterlife. I don't think that's a real thing. So how best can we live in this life? And it's to strip away these things that are illusory and to take a good look at your life and figure out what in fact is illusory. And that's what I learned how to do. And I didn't do it entirely in that year, but it's been 27 years since then. And it's been an ongoing process. And I suspect it'll be a never ending process because, I don't know if human beings are perfectible. I know that I'm not. So for me, the exercise is just keep going in this direction. And what the book did, rather what the experience did, and I give Susan a big assist on this because she has helped me along the way immensely, is keep exploring those things that make life richer and more true and better for you individually. And it's not the same for each person. It's an individual thing for every one of us. And I learned my own way of doing it. And the reason the book ultimately is not didactic is it doesn't say do this and do that. It's here's what happened to me. Here's how I responded. Here's what's gone on since. And from that, I think people can extrapolate aspects of from my story, can perhaps project themselves into it in a way that might be helpful. And I'll say this, my novels, however entertaining they might be or whatever value they have as literature, I don't exactly think are like how-to manuals in terms of how to live your life particularly. But this one, because of what I went through and mistakes I made and kind of silly and dumb things I did, turns out there's some lessons to be gleaned, really. And that was kind of, for me, both the humiliating part of writing the book, because I did stupid things, and the fun part and the really gratifying part was ultimately, I did learn from things and bad things that happened, and I experimented and learned just a new way of being that's God, it sounds so gassy, but the takeaway for me is that it remains an ongoing thing. And it's all, and it will be until I die and go into the non-afterlife.
And I think that there's a thread running through it as well, which is that I can't remember who said hell is other people,
Right?
But part of the lesson of this book is that heaven is other people.
That's exactly right. No, that's exactly right. When I remember, there's a quick anecdote I tell in the book, and Art, I hope you're still listening, about my dad when I was, about 10 years old, and I was in the den with him, and I said, what do the Jews think happens when you die? And my dad says, well, you live on in the hearts of others. And I thought, really? That's the hearts of others, and I thought of that, that Woody Allen joke, I want to live on in someone's apartment, and at the time it seemed like weak tea, but now, no, not at all. I mean, because again, the afterlife idea is, people will debate it forever and ever. I haven't been convinced. So I buy into the idea that this is it. And so heaven is here. This is heaven. We're there. It's this, and it's our jobs to make the best of it.
Well, thanks, Seth, and thanks for letting me be part of this tonight.
Thank you.
And thanks to Chevaliers.
Yes, thank you both so much for joining us. It's been absolutely lovely. If you would like to get a copy of Seth's wonderful book, please email us at chevaliersbooks@gmail.com. We would love to put one into your hands from 6 feet away. It would bring us great joy to see you behind plexiglass. And have a lovely evening. We'll hopefully see you at the next event.
Thank you very much.